your estranged parent wants to go to therapy, and you're not sure if that's something that you would like to do, or even how to go about it, and how can you trust it, and all of those types of things. I've been talking about this quite a bit lately because of some comments that I've received, and I'm going to reply to a comment about how to go through finding a therapist and all of that sort of thing, and what that looks like, and what about if your estranged parent isn't already in therapy. I'll read the comment and then I'm going to go ahead and respond to it. And before I do that, I just want to say that when I'm talking about this stuff, I have the recognition that not every situation and person and place you are in your healing and your relationships are the same. I don't know you personally. So I try to give advice that's broad for that reason. I think we need to be careful not to be so rigid in talking about this, because again, not every situation is the same. And I don't know where you are in terms of how you're feeling about going to therapy, your strengths, what could trigger you, could it throw you back? I don't know that. So only you know that for sure. I'm going to give you kind of an overview of what I've seen as a therapist who works with survivors of narcissistic family systems. So all I work with are people who come from that type of dysfunction, those cult-like families. And not to say I won't work with anybody else, but this is my area of expertise. This is my knowledge, because this is also my lived experience. So without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? What I like about the last set of videos is that it's making me think a little bit about what the parameters are for therapy. But if she doesn't have a current therapist and she suggests I search for someone, then what am I looking for in a therapist in terms of qualifications and experience and modality? In brackets, if that's something that's important. If there are any important questions to ask. Sorry if this is something discussed in a previous video. I've only been watching your channel recently. Thanks. I'm going to link this or put in the description of this video the few videos that I've done addressing this, and this is your second time commenting and we're kind of in the same vein, but this way people can kind of see the history of what's going on. And as a brief overview, this person has a child with who's chronically ill, and she also is estranged from her mother. Family's gone after her. The thing that we so often see as the person who decides that we're no longer going to stay in toxic and emotionally damaging, dangerous relationships anymore, and then the whole family, bands together because that person that we estranged from typically will say, oh, they won't let me have my grandchild, and I can't believe it, and this, that, and the other, and they I hate the words play the victim, but they actually do. They play the victims of the children who went no contact with them, and then get all the rest of the flying monkeys, aka family members, to start making calls. Your mother's really worried about you. She misses her grandchild and all this and all that. So anyway, in saying that, I know that this person has had some of that pressure, which is unfortunately not unusual. I got those calls too, and I know the majority of people that I end up addressing or that I have in counseling are also people who got those calls. Number one, if you go, you're going for you, period. End of story. You're not going to people please. You're not going to make it seem like you've done everything that you can and all of this and all of that. You're going for you. In saying that, take a moment, and I know you didn't ask this, but I think it needs to be said. Take a moment and make a list of the pros and cons of going and what your expectations are, best case scenario, and what's the worst thing that can happen. Take some time to really examine your own feelings and determine whether or not this is something you really genuinely deep down want, and something that you can handle if your mother ends up doing some emotional harm to you. I think you can. I think we all can. But that doesn't mean that we're always in a place where we can. So I just want to say that. I think that we all can at some point in time, but we're not always in that place and space to be able to handle the manipulation and the guilt and all of the things that we've been working so hard to get away from. That being said, number one, if your mother doesn't have a therapist, that's alarming. That's a red flag to me. And I'm not saying that you should go to her therapist necessarily. I'm just saying if she hasn't already started to do the work, I would be really hesitant to even bother showing up, because it's kind of like burning a sales lead. You know you're not equipped, you're not prepared, you don't have the stuff that you need or the samples and stuff like that, and you go in and you blow it because you weren't prepared for it. This is kind of like that. Your mother not going and doing any work on herself to be introspective about her contribution to the demise of the relationship or non-relationship as it stands right now is a definite red flag that she is just looking to fix without doing the work. Finding a therapist. You don't have to go to her therapist. And if you do, I said it in the earlier video, each of you needs to have a session alone with that therapist prior to meeting together to set out boundaries and also to make it known what you're looking for and give the therapist your history with your parent. Ideally, it would be good if you had a therapist that you brought your mother to, because it should be on your terms. She should be going to her own therapist, and whoever you have, you go to your therapist so that you have somebody who has more than one session worth of history. Remember, you're the damaged party here. And if your mother isn't willing to lean in your direction, she's already telling you that she doesn't care about your comfort. And just a little warning on all of this. If it doesn't work out in therapy, your mother will blame the therapist and say the therapist sucked. And then they'll say, yeah, you're just going to someone who is telling you what you want to hear and they weren't facilitating anything, and they'll completely blame the therapist, which doesn't really matter, but I want you to know that that's something that they're likely to do. And if you choose a therapist because you don't have one and your mother hasn't gone to therapy and worked on her wounds and done what she needs to do, if it goes sideways, she'll blame the therapist. She'll say you picked a bad one. So in all worlds, it's going to be your fault if your mother hasn't gone and done the work that actually she needs to do in order to have a therapy session with you, or 2 or 3 or 10 or however many it takes. If she's looking for a quick fix just to make it seem like she's doing everything she can, it is what it is. You'll have your answer and kind of a validation that you did everything you could for yourself, you're going for you, and that nothing has changed and therapy is likely not going to fix the issue. Picking a therapist. Number one, I would say whoever you choose, you make sure that it's somebody who's familiar with your type of family dynamic. So if your family dynamic, for example, is narcissistic family system, and maybe you don't know that, but if it's dysfunctional families that have estranged, let's put it that way, you want to look for a therapist who has experience with that, because you don't want to end up in a therapy session with someone who is, but their family, it's your mother, she did the best she could, you need to understand her, that sort of thing. You don't want to end up in that type of environment. And there's therapists who will push for that. I hate to say this, and I hope nobody comes for me, but you probably want to stay away from counselors that work within religious systems, because they are very heavy-handed on forgiveness and family and behavior be damned kind of thing. Degree-wise, that's really a personal choice. That's up to you. I don't have a degree, and many of my clients are people who have bigger degrees. Like, I have PhDs, I have psychologists, I have psychiatrists, and I receive recommendations from them as well. It really depends on how you feel about that. That's, I think, a personal choice. Be prepared to even have to try out a few different therapists. The first meeting can tell you something, but it can't tell you everything. Write a list. I'm big on the list. What would you like to get out of the therapy session or therapy in general with that therapist? What are your belief systems? So, for example, I don't feel that forgiveness is necessary to healing, I'm going to ask a therapist how they feel about that. Because if that's a big deal to them, I'm in the wrong place. Another big deal to me is that the therapist has some personal experience with my personal experience. I'm not looking for them to disclose their trauma to me or, divulge stuff that isn't any of my business. But I will ask, like, what's your family experience? Are you similar to me? Do you have a dynamic that you come from where you've actually had to work through this on your own and you really have personal firsthand experience regarding what that looks like? That's important to me. It may not be important to somebody else. Bottom line, figure out what's important to you and lead with that. I hope this has been helpful. I appreciate your comments. This is really good dialogue to have. There's not a lot of us out there whose parents are willing to go to therapy and willing to try to work on it, but it's not a quick fix. And if they're approaching it that way, then that's your kind of clue to say, listen, I'm happy to go to therapy with you at some point, but you need to have gone to therapy for some period of time for me to feel safe. Let's visit this 6 months from now. If you're willing to do that, that's great. And if you're not, well, then you're not.